Let's bring in a specialist on the gun debate. Benjamin Dowd-Arrow. He also serves as Associate Director of the Public Health Program at Florida State University. Benjamin, first, your reaction to what is happening in Maine. And based on the information out there right now, what is your assessment of the situation and this person of interest?
Okay, so first off, thank you for having me. And my initial reaction is just sadness. Anytime one of these events happen, it's, usually a very senseless seeming tragedy, especially to learn that it was at a bowling alley where young people were impacted. As many as 22 people may have been killed in this. I know 18 are confirmed. And that's the initial reaction, is just sadness and almost just a resignation in that this is just so common in the United States.
Well, much has been said about the requirements for owning a gun in the state of Maine. In this country, we hear much of the same comments after a mass shooting, issues around access and prevention. What were the failures in this situation? Because as we just heard, this was a person who had a license to carry the gun, was trained in carrying a firearm, and had access to a firearm.
Yeah, so I think when we start looking at some of the failures, Maine has much higher gun mortality than surrounding states like Massachusetts or New York or New Jersey. The mortality rate in Maine is about 4 times higher than Massachusetts, for instance, using the 2022 numbers. And Maine has constitutional carry. So there's not a lot of in the way of background checks on whether or not a person should be carrying a gun. But one of the biggest failures, I think, is that we don't do enough for mental health in this country. This is a person who's a veteran. Police in their report this morning talked about how that he had been in a mental health institution and that he was hearing voices. And if we had something like a red flag law in place or mental health background checks, this is somebody that may have had a much harder time getting access to a gun, and it may have even prevented this event from happening.
You describe yourself as a gun scholar with recent research examining the impact that firearms play on health and well-being. So adding on to what you just said, is there anything that could have been done here or what could be done in the future to prevent something like this from happening? And it's so different because every state has different laws, and then you look at federal laws as well, so it gets complicated.
Yeah, and the bulk of gun laws are handled by the state. The federal laws, there's not that many of them overall. But I will point out that even in the Heller decision, which opened up the right to own a handgun, Antonin Scalia mentioned that the Heller decision should not be taken to imply that we allow guns to people who are considered mentally unfit. And that's a longstanding tradition in the United States. So someone who had been put into a mental hospital for emotional distress, hearing voices, should have been a red flag for family members and law enforcement to keep an eye on this person and maybe preclude them from being able to access a gun until a doctor deemed that they were healthy enough to, be involved in society. So when we're looking at some of these impacts, if we had better reporting in place where law enforcement may have been made aware that this person was hearing voices and had access to firearms and had just been in a mental hospital, maybe they could have done a wellness check and checked in on him before this happened.
And Benjamin, just time for one quick short answer, but I got to ask you, because we hear about this all the time, for folks outside the United States looking at situations like this. This doesn't really happen in other countries on this scale with this frequency, and don't want to generalize, but when you look at this, you hear about mental health issues. There are mental health issues all over the world.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to compare the United States to other countries, just in that there are only 3 countries in the world with a constitutional amendment that says that there is some form of a right to own a firearm. So it makes it really hard to compare it to even nations that have similar colonial histories like Australia. But it is a telling trend that we do have this problem and other countries don't. And, some of those countries that don't do have a history of gun ownership. So I do think that Americans, gun owners and non-gun owners, really need to come together to figure out what can we do that doesn't infringe on those constitutional rights so that people can, exercise their constitutional rights, while at the same time making sure that things like happen in Lewiston, Maine do not happen anywhere else.
All right, Benjamin Dowd-Arrow, we appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us from Tallahassee, Florida.